In this lesson, I'm going to explain the After Effects workflow. Now, I've mentioned previously that there is no standard approach when you're creating a project inside After Effects because there are so many different features, and you typically cherry pick from all those features to create something that matches your vision. But there is a basic workflow, and I want to explain that here in this lesson. First order of business is to start a new project, and that's very simple. You simply name the project and select some location for it inside your computer where you want to store that project file. Once the project is created, then you import and organize assets. Now, assets are referred to in After Effects as footage. I like to use the term assets, though, because I use that when I talk about other production premium products like Premiere Pro, Encore, Audition, and Photoshop. So I'll refer to files that you import into After Effects as assets most of the time, but I'll occasionally also point out that they're referred to as footage inside After Effects. Now, when you import an asset, you're not actually moving it from some location in your computer to some other place. You're not storing it inside the project file. It stays in its original location. You're simply creating a link to that asset. After Effects is a reference-based program. It refers to these assets. It doesn't move them. And so when you play a video file, for example, inside a comp, it's not actually moving that video file into the project. It's simply playing it off its original location on your computer. So you're not really creating these monstrous files full of assets. You're just creating files with links to those assets. And once you put those links inside the project panel inside After Effects, then you typically want to organize them. So you typically put a bunch of assets that are similar inside a folder, for example, just to kind of organize things inside the workplace. After you've imported some assets, then you create one or more compositions, or comps as they're called inside After Effects. Creating comps is a little bit more complex than starting a new project because you typically create a comp to match the characteristics of the asset that you're putting in the comp. So if you're going to have a video background inside a composition, you make the composition match the scale and frame rate of that video clip, for example. Once you've created your compositions, you add and arrange layers in those compositions. Now, when you add an asset to a comp, that asset is in its own separate layer. So you add an image file or audio or video or a graphic, it resides in its own layer. If you add another video file, you can't put it in an existing layer. It has to be in its own layer. And even if you split a video file in two, for example, it puts that split portion on another layer. So you can't have multiple assets in a single layer. You can also create layers from within After Effects. You create text layers, shape layers, and other layer types like lights, cameras, something called a null object layer, or an adjustment layer. We'll talk about those things in much more detail as we go through the course. Inside the comp, you can sometimes combine layers. Now, let's say you've got a text file, and that's residing on top of a video file. So you can see the underlying video layer below the text layer without any problem at all. You don't have to do anything to sort of combine them. But some layers need to be combined in some way that you can see the two layers together. And to do that, you use masks or blending modes or keying effects to do that. Then you can adjust and animate layer properties. Now, most layers have certain properties like scale, position, rotation, and opacity, but other layers have additional properties like text and shape layers have all kinds of really cool properties that allow you to animate those shapes and those texts. In any event, you can adjust and animate them, and by animate them, I mean you can change them over time using keyframes. Then you can add effects and adjust and animate effect properties. Now, when you think of effects, you typically think of video effects. There's a whole slew of video effects inside After Effects, of course. But other things also are so-called effects. The paint tool, clone stamp, rotor brush, and puppa, those are all effects. And that gets a little confusing sometimes. You're not creating new layers when you work with those tools. You're actually applying those tools to a layer. So they, in fact, are video effects as well. Now, throughout the process, you are previewing your work, but certainly when you finish your work, you want to preview it to make sure it's working exactly the way you want it to work. And once you're happy with your work, then you render and export it. Now, by rendering, it means that you're taking all this work, which is just a bunch of data. It's not a video file that you're creating ongoing. It's just a whole bunch of data that you get to see play back inside the comp. But when you're ready to actually give it to somebody so people can view it, you need to render it as a type of video file that can be viewed elsewhere. And once it's rendered, then you export it, meaning that you turn it into a video file and store it someplace in your computer such that you can then play it back or then distribute it. So that is the sort of generic workflow for After Effects. You won't necessarily follow this order when you make things, and you'll take lots of detours along the way. But this is the basic approach you'll take when you work with comps inside After Effects projects.